Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm not going to do a presentation video today. On this video, I'm just going to talk. Specifically, I'm going to talk about one word, and that word is consensus. And I want to do that because that is a very important word. Understanding what consensus means, for me anyway, is an important means of understanding how to conduct my business, how to conduct work. So I want to talk about this concept because I think a lot of people get it wrong, and so it's worth a discussion on this topic. So what I think people get wrong with consensus is too often they think it means getting other people to agree with you. And whilst there's an element of that, that is actually not the full case. That is not what consensus necessarily means. Let's take democracy. That's a great example. Democracy works very much on the basis of consensus. So when you vote for whoever is going to be in charge of the government. Now I know what some of you might say. You might be saying, but you didn't vote for the Conservative government, and therefore you did not consent to them being in power. Well, actually, you did. And the reason why is because even if you didn't vote for them, you accept the system, the democratic system, that those who win the most votes are the ones that form the government. If you didn't accept that consensus, then the alternative, to democracy really is, well, we've seen it across the world. When the consensus in the democratic system breaks down, quite often violence will usually result. That could be violence by the people who do not agree with the consensus, and that quite often would usually be met by violence from the state. So generally, everyone has agreed, as a consensus, that even if you don't like whoever has won the election, you accept that they have won, and you wait, 5 years until the next time when you can try again. But this is one of the great things about democracy, is if you don't accept the consensus, then you have democratic means by which you can campaign against it. You can protest, you can do campaigns, you can vote for things that go against the consensus. But the point is that even those on the losing side are part of the consensus because they accept how the system works. Without that consensus, no democratic system can properly function. Now, I don't need to tell this to people of Northern Ireland, I'm sure. They know what it is like to live in an environment when the consensus is not accepted. That was the time of the Troubles. So that is when democratic institutions fail. That is when the consensus is not accepted in a democratic system. Turning a bit more specifically to sort of things that I tend to deal with. When preparing for any kind of negotiation, I always tell people it's absolutely critical to get consensus from your own side before you go anywhere near negotiating with the other side. Because consensus in the negotiation sense is internal and external. So turning to the internal first, there are two elements to it. When you're trying to develop a negotiation position, you need to consult a wide range of people. They may not agree with that position, but the whole point is they get to be a part in its construction. And even if they don't fully agree with it, they will accept the consensus of the majority or whoever decides the position is. Because consensus is not necessarily about majority opinion. Consensus can be achieved because one person with a strong will has decided, or with power, let's say a person in authority, has decided that is what the position will be. And even though a whole range of other more junior people may not agree with it, they will go along with that as the consensus. That is how the consensus is created in that sort of scenario. But that's not necessarily, or that quite rarely, is a good approach. The whole point about a negotiation, or any professional negotiator, will go out and build that consensus by speaking to as many people as possible, taking on all their views, all their criticism, and coming out with a fully developed position at the end of it. The other aspect of obtaining internal consensus is it's a form of due diligence. You may think you've got a great idea, a great position, but there'll be a whole host of things that you may not be aware of, you may not understand the implications of. So the process of obtaining consensus is not only to get everyone on the same page and to support your position, but it's also a way of testing it, testing the ideas, testing the argument, and refining it, spotting any flaws, addressing those flaws. So done properly, there's two particular outcomes of internal consensus building. Everyone backs the position, whether they agree with it or not, and you've done your best as possible to make it as robust and as solid a position, through analysis, through argument, and so on. So when it comes to building consensus externally, and in negotiation sense that usually means with whoever you're negotiating with, then you go to those negotiations with a lot of authority, with a lot of knowledge, and so on. And if you use appropriate and good techniques, you will hopefully persuade the other side to also join in the consensus and on terms of that position, albeit with a few refinements. That is what negotiation is about in a very simplified nutshell. Where people go wrong in negotiation is they try to shortcut that. They try to, well, we're in a rush, the boss has said this is what must happen, and so they shortcut that consensus. And what that very often means is a whole bunch of people don't agree, they don't line up, and as I say, you don't have to agree on the consensus, but you do have to understand what it is and in public support it. So when at a negotiation, you do not want someone on your own side saying, oh yeah, this idea is rubbish. You know, that completely undermines your position. They have to be on board with the consensus, and that means they have to have had the chance to input before, you know, it is put to that negotiation. So you're getting a whole bunch of people to be on the same page. That gives you a lot of authority. But also you're testing it. And this is where people keep going wrong. They keep not wanting to do this hard work. And when they do that, all those flaws, all those weaknesses come out in the pressurized environment of the negotiation table. So that's negotiation. That's the importance of consensus in that context. Turning more to current affairs, which is mainly what's triggered this video. Government, all government, unless you're in a dictatorship, is about consensus. Now usually, even non-democratic governments require consensus. Even dictators need everyone to agree that essentially they are in power. Because if they don't have that form of consensus, then people would constantly try to challenge them. And, you know, in a less violent way, that is true in any democratic system. So any government not only needs the consent of the people for the system and their right to operate, but any politician within the government also needs to build consensus to get policies implemented. Now this is one of the things that tends to annoy me when people point towards successful businessmen and say, yes, they will be great in government, they should be in charge. That is completely flawed thinking. Being a successful businessman does not necessarily require them to be good at building consensus. A very good business leader will understand consensus and hopefully will have skills in that direction. But that is not a guarantee. That is not a given. So you cannot point to any particular individual who doesn't operate within a political context and say they will be great in government if they do not have any evidence of consensus building. Because unlike in a business, government is all about persuading people to do things that they don't necessarily want to do. And if you're not their boss, you don't have that control over them. Businesses do not operate that way, as a rule. So successful politicians are ones that build consensus. Now, consensus, as I said, is not about everyone agreeing. It's about critical mass. You need just enough people in the right places in order to achieve that critical mass or consensus. So politicians that are in government, particularly ministers, will need that critical mass of MPs behind them. They'll also need that critical mass of civil servants willing to implement it. And the whole system of government needs to be willing to swing behind that policy to try and make it work. Now, the problem I'm finding in current British politics is that there seems to be far too many politicians who no longer understand the concept of consensus. They don't understand that you cannot just roll into a government department, tell them you want them to do something, and expect it to be implemented flawlessly without that consensus building. So let's turn to Prime Minister Liz Truss and her current troubles. Because here's the big problem for her. Her consensus is extremely shaky. She has achieved consensus that she should be the leader of the Conservative Party, but she had not achieved consensus for a wide variety of the policies that she wants to implement. Now, you can argue this is because of the way that she was elected, but I would also go deeper than that and say because she had not spent the time talking to her MPs, getting their support, getting that critical mass of backbench Tory MPs to support her policies, not just the fact that she is the leader. So what we're seeing now is a really classic example of what it looks like when you fail to build a consensus. You end up with a lot of back briefing, you end up with a lot of challenges, a lot of people refusing to support, and all of that will erupt into the open, fatally undermining your credibility as the leader. And that is exactly what has happened to Liz Truss. She thought the battle was over because she was elected leader. She never seemed to have thought that the battle had only just begun, that the whole process of making sure that the political machinery was behind her before she started announcing things. Normally, when any Prime Minister takes charge, and here's an example, they will balance their cabinet. They won't have everyone in the cabinet that they want, or trust even, but what they will have is a wide variety of people that represent the different factions in their party. And they do that because they know that is part of the process of building consensus. Even if any particular faction does not necessarily agree with what they want to do, they will at least support the position because they have been listened to and they have representation on the cabinet. Liz Truss has not done any of that. She had just stuffed the cabinet with a whole bunch of people that are very closely ideologically aligned to her, but not necessarily ideologically aligned to the wider party. So again, that is another example of a huge failure to build consensus. So when you look at all the problems and all the political news and stories that are currently doing the round, think about consensus. Think about what she should have done as a leader to build consensus, because we do live in a democracy for now, and leaders cannot rule without consensus. That is just a fundamental fact. And I would encourage you to think a bit wider about that in any work that you do, whether in the personal or professional context. Think of any big and complicated task that you have to do, any big project, for example, and appreciate the fact that for project success, you also need consensus. You need people to agree you can have the money, or their time, or their skill set, or particular resources that they have control over. So this is why I always point out that consensus is such a crucial word. Without consensus, there's very little you can do in any particular environment. I mean, sure, you don't need a consensus if you're doing a single simple task that just needs you to do it. You can do that yourself. It doesn't require consensus. But anything big and complicated, and a negotiation, or ruling a political party, or being in government, or in charge of business even, all of that requires consensus. And this is why, and negotiators understand this, and this is why good negotiators spend a huge amount of time on stakeholder management, on consensus building. Unfortunately, so should a good politician should be doing the same for pretty much the same reason. Unfortunately, the UK system does not have good politicians. So I hope you found this talk interesting and helpful and thought-provoking, and I look forward to seeing the comments in the box below.